Chapter 1: The Road to Istanbul. I never expected to flee my hometown carrying only a duffel bag stuffed with threadbare sweaters, half my mother's hopes, and the stale memory of a father I barely knew. But there I was, pressed into a bus seat that smelled like old chewing gum and hot plastic, the frosty Ukrainian plains rolling by outside. My mother had her face practically glued to the smeared window, inhaling a vision of a new horizon. I was not sure what she saw, maybe the glow of a promised land beyond the border. All I saw was a grayish sky merging into a dull road. We left in the middle of February, when the wind in our hometown carved like 1,000 knives. My mother insisted that the scalding heat of Turkey would make up for every Ukrainian winter we had suffered. She told me, "In Istanbul, you'll finally breathe easy, Yet my lungs felt squeezed. The bus rattled so hard over potholes that I thought my ribcage would crack. I remember hugging my knees to my chest and feeling the sticky vinyl seat catch at my jeans whenever I shifted. My mother twirled a cheap silver ring around her finger. She had been wearing it ever since he sent it by mail, a man I had never met, whose photo lived on her phone screen. She talked about how he had promised her a grand apartment in Istanbul, about how he was well-connected, about how he would protect us. "He's kind," she insisted. But the ring looked too tight on her hand, leaving a puffy ridge of skin around it. She said it was because her fingers were swollen from the bus ride. I had an uneasy feeling it was more about illusions than sodium retention. Around hour 10 of the journey, I stretched my legs into the aisle, ignoring the muttered complaints from other passengers, mostly older women with scarves wrapped around their heads, or men traveling to find work across borders. The road seemed to jerk us from side to side, and every so often we would bounce up so high our hair would brush the overhead shelves. I guess that's how freedom felt for us. Jarring, unpredictable, hurting my tailbone more than setting me free. We spent a fitful night in a cheap hostel near the border, my mother clutching her phone, waiting for updates from the man. I refused to call him stepfather or father figure, or anything that suggested a permanent place in our lives. I had no illusions that he would be the father I never had. Still, something about the way she smiled at his messages made me want to believe. This weird mix of resentment and longing clogged up my throat so that I mostly kept silent. The next day, we crossed the border. A swarm of people lined up in front of passport officers. The wind outside battered the bus, but inside the air was humid with the press of so many bodies. A guard glowered at my passport, flipping through its pages, a suspicious flicker in his eyes when he noticed how young I was, 16 and heading to Turkey with a mother who barely had more than a tourist visa. For a moment, I was convinced we would be turned back, that fate would intervene. But the guard just slapped his stamp and let us through. That was the moment I realized there was no going back. Before that stamp, I could pretend we would spontaneously decide to return to Ukraine, that we would walk off the bus, giggling about how silly we had been to chase impossible dreams. After the stamp, my heart sank, and a hush settled over me, like some cosmic door had just slammed shut. The hours blurred after that. Snow gave way to slushy earth, then to highways lined by scrubby trees I could not name. My mother fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, that ring glittering in the faint overhead light. I stared out the window, my breath clouding the glass. We did not belong anywhere, I thought. Not in Ukraine, not in the unknown place we were rushing toward. I mentally counted the money we had left, just enough for a month of living, maybe 2 if we were extremely frugal. According to my mother, the man had it all covered. According to me, I'd have to find a plan B soon. When the bus driver finally announced Istanbul, it was late evening. The city lights glimmered like a massive swarm of neon insects. I had never seen such a sprawling place. Buildings were packed so tightly they looked like they were stacked on top of each other. People crowded the station, yelling in Turkish, lugging enormous suitcases, wearing frustrated expressions. As soon as we stepped off, the smell of exhaust and roasting chestnuts smacked my nose. Hot, sticky air replaced the winter chill. My mother looked around in wonder. I felt a rush of panic that I tried to swallow. He was there, at least. The man. Tall, stocky, thick black hair, slicked back with gel. He greeted my mother with a broad grin that revealed a gold tooth, then glanced at me like I was an afterthought. "Welcome," he said in Russian thickened by a Turkish accent. The crowd pressed around us. and in the swirl of new voices I lost track of my mother's expression. Maybe it was hopeful, maybe it was relieved. All I sensed was the city's pulse beating under my feet, as if it had 1,000 hearts all pounding at once, eager to swallow me whole. He led us to an older car with peeling seat covers. We rattled through narrow streets that twisted like labyrinths. The headlights revealed worn-down buildings and laundry lines zigzagging overhead. Vendors sold bread, spices, and produce from small sidewalk stands. It was mesmerizing and terrifying. Occasionally, I glimpsed the vast expanse of the Bosphorus, lit by ships and floating lights, but mostly I saw battered walls and graffiti. My mother kept murmuring how romantic it all looked under the moonlight. I kept silent. We stopped in front of a shabby 5-story building. The man pointed up. "We're on the 2nd floor." My mother clung to him, brimming with nervous gratitude, while I tried to drag our bags from the trunk. Up a dark stairwell we went, concrete steps chipped at the edges, the scent of frying onions wafting down from someone's kitchen. The door to our new home squeaked open. Inside, a small living room, a tiny kitchen with stained tiles, and 2 cramped bedrooms. The overhead light flickered, as though deciding if it wanted to work at all. Immediately I noticed bars over the windows, presumably for safety. But it felt like I had stepped into a prison cell, masquerading as an apartment. He introduced us to his mother, his sister, and an older woman, who might have been his grandmother. They sized us up, eyes narrowed. I could practically see them labeling me. "The girl he has to feed." Their expressions said, "We never asked for you. We do not want you." Their lips parted in tight-lipped hellos. My mother tried greeting them politely in Russian or halting Turkish. They just nodded. He promised my mother we would not stay with his family forever, just until he saved up enough for our own place. Yet I felt the tension swirling like a trapped breeze between these walls. We placed our few suitcases in a corner. The man showed me the smaller bedroom, where I would sleep on a mattress on the floor. "You'll be comfortable," he announced. The family hovered in the background, whispering words I partially understood. "She's too old. She does not speak Turkish. She can help with chores." My mother beamed at them, probably to hide her nervousness. Night felt thick. Traffic outside roared like a beast that never slept. I tried to rest, but I sensed roaches scuttling behind the walls, the flicker of a bare light bulb in the hallway making weird shadows under the door. My mother was in the adjoining room with him, presumably talking about the future. I stared at the cracked ceiling. This was the fresh start she had promised. My chest felt heavy, as though the entire city was pressing down, telling me I had to adapt or get crushed. When morning came, I found the family in the kitchen. The grandmother offered me bread without even looking my way, thrust it in my hand like feeding a stray cat. One of the older women hissed in Turkish about me being ungrateful. My mother and I exchanged uneasy glances. She squeezed my hand, and I almost believed we could handle it, until the man walked in, a proud grin on his face, instructing me to help cook. His mother barked at me, something about chopping onions. I misheard or misunderstood, trying to respond in my broken Turkish. Frustrated, she snatched the knife and glared. My mother, wide-eyed, whispered to me, "Try harder. They do not mean to be rude, it is just their way." But I knew that was a convenient excuse. They did not want me here. They barely tolerated my mother. So, I learned not to speak unless spoken to. I learned to wipe the counters, set the table, and swallow my pride. A few days in, the man I hated calling him my stepfather, but I lacked a better name, decided I was being disrespectful. I had asked a question about calling home or something trivial. He snapped at me in a burst of temper. Next thing I knew, he had smacked me across the jaw. My ears rang. I stumbled, shock numbing me more than pain. The rest of the family pretended not to see. He said something about teaching me manners. My mother stood by, silent, tears gathering in her eyes. But she did not intervene, did not wrap me in her arms to shield me. Afterward, she found me trembling in the bathroom, hands pressed against the sink. Her voice quivered. "He is good to us, Ina. He just has a temper. We will be okay." That was the first time in Istanbul I felt genuine hate. It was not just directed at him, but at her willful blindness, at the bars on the windows, at the city that did not care. I remember looking in the mirror that day, noticing how my cheeks swelled. I thought, you asked for a new life, right? Well, here it is. The days blurred together. My mother tried cooking new Turkish dishes, hoping to appease his family, while I mostly stayed in the bedroom or ventured out to explore the cramped streets. He started hinting about me finding work. Teenagers can make good money, he said. Plenty of shops need workers. There was an oily undercurrent to his voice that made me uneasy, as if he had bigger plans than just me being a shop girl. Outside, Istanbul assaulted my senses, street vendors shouting, cats slinking along rooftops, the smell of grilled fish near the water, bright scarves billowing from stalls. I felt a spark of curiosity, thinking maybe this city was not so bad. But returning to that apartment always reminded me of the suffocating presence of his family. They peppered me with criticisms in a language they assumed I could not follow. The older woman, his grandmother, spat the word yabansi at me more times than I could count. Each night, my mother forced a smile, saying, "We will move soon, Ina," he promised. She showed me pictures on her phone. A fancy district near Taksim Square, big windows, modern furniture. She believed him wholeheartedly. As for me, I was storing up every small humiliation, every bruise, countless reasons to doubt him. Yet I said nothing. Because what if this were all we could have? I turned 16 in that apartment. Nobody celebrated except my mother, who managed to buy a small pastry from a shop down the road. She placed a single candle in the cream and sang a muted happy birthday in Russian, tears in her eyes. The man was out doing business, which probably meant drinking and bragging to his friends about his new foreign wife. She gave me a hug, so tightly I could feel her trembling. I realized then that she was as scared as I was, maybe more. It twisted my stomach with guilt and sorrow. She was chasing a better life for both of us, but we had stepped into a place we did not understand. One evening, I managed to slip out onto the narrow balcony to get fresh air. From there, I saw other balconies across the street, women hanging laundry, men yelling into cell phones, kids squealing as they passed a soccer ball in a cramped courtyard. It was so alive, so normal, and I was on the second floor, caged behind iron bars that hammered home the sense of entrapment. I spent half the night perched there, despite the cold. The city's noise lulled me into a dazed acceptance. We were in Istanbul, with no savings, no real allies except a man who seemed more a threat than a provider. My mother's blind faith in him was unwavering, though. Sometimes I envied how easily she pinned her hopes on illusions. It was not long before the man announced he had found me a place to work. He said it with a smug grin, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the floor. "It is in Lalali, a district full of shops. You'll make decent money. Help with the rent." He mentioned it casually, but the glance he exchanged with his mother felt loaded. I was about to become another source of income for them. My mother's eyes shone with relief, though. She thought it was an opportunity. I was too exhausted to argue. Maybe a job in a clothing store or a restaurant would not be so bad, I told myself. So I said, "Fine," quietly, ignoring the flare of triumph in his eyes. He told me we would start the next morning. That night, I could not sleep. The radiator hissed, the city outside pulsed, and in the next room, I heard them talking in low tones. My mother was giggling like a girl, probably reading too much positivity into the situation. I pressed a pillow against my ears. I tried not to think about how I had come to this city full of illusions, only to realize illusions can morph into nightmares. When the sun rose, I felt a flicker of something, determination or defiance. I am not sure which. I would go along with their plan, but I would keep my eyes open. If there was any chance to get out from under his thumb, I'd take it. Because despite my mother's starry-eyed fantasies, I knew better. In Istanbul, naive hearts get devoured fast. I told myself, this might be a prison, but you can still find a key. Maybe the key was a job, or a new friend, or a bus ticket out of here. I did not know. I just knew I had to look for it. For my mother's sake, and maybe for my own sake too. The day I stepped beyond that rusted apartment gate, the city swallowed me in its swirling chaos. I had no clue how far down I would sink, but at least I was awake enough to realize I was sinking. I still hoped, in some small corner of my heart, that the city would show me mercy. But the truth was, I had to start showing mercy to myself first.